Okay, this is part 2 of reading of this book, The World History Time Chart of the Histomap of Peoples and Nations for 4,000 Years by John B. Sparks. We're reading about the Americas, and this is part 2, Territorial Expansion Continued. And during the 1840s, the notion that it was the United States' manifest destiny, to claim territory right across to the western seaboard was evoked by supporters of this policy against those who wanted to develop the economy without further geographical enlargement. The issue of slavery, the bedrock of the southern plantation colonies for 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, sharply divided opinion from the onset of the Union. During the 1840s, the abolitionist movement became more vocal, and slave ownership became the focus for fundamental differences in economic and social outlook between the industrialized North and the agrarian South. The pro-slavery faction was concerned to maintain the balance between slave states and free states in the Senate, and the issue of the states of the new territory that joined the Union became increasingly divisive. The conflict reached a head when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860 without the support of a single southern state. 7 southern states seceded from the Union and set up the Confederate States of America in February 1861, with Jefferson Davis as president. The Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, a Federal Army base in Charleston, marked the beginning of 4 years of bloody civil war that cost the lives of over 600,000 soldiers. The northern states had the advantage of a larger population and better industrial base, but the southern states controlled a much larger territory, and initial hopes of a swift resolution soon disappeared. The final northern victory in 1865 ensured the survival of the Union and the abolition of slavery. Federal laws were enacted to ensure the rights of freed black people and a process of reconstruction was set in train in the southern states. There was considerable southern resentment of northern interference, and from 1890s, many southern states continued to discriminate against and disenfranchise black people. The late 19th and early 20th century saw rapid growth of industrial productivity and prosperity. Immigration supplied a large pool of labor and contributed to the diversity of the northern industrial cities. Reformers of the progressive movement addressed issues such as women's suffrage, workers' rights, public education, and public health. Foremost among these was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, from 1901 to 1909, the United States remained neutral at the outbreak of the First World War, but responded to the threat of the German submarine campaign and entered the war decisively in 1917, contributing to the Allied victory. The economic growth of the United States during the 1920s came to an abrupt halt when the stock market crashed in 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies during the 1930s regulated banking and introduced reforms to address the problems of the agriculture sector in particular. However, it was not until the Second World War that the American economy recovered under the impact of federal spending to support the war effort. The United States declined to join the League of Nations after the First World War, and its initial involvement in the Second World War was limited to supplying materials to the Allied forces. However, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 saw the United States enter the war directly, and it was instrumental in defeating Germany through its bombing campaigns and the massive D-Day invasion in 1944. The defeat of Japan was completed with the dropping of 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and the United States participation in the post-war United Nations marked a move towards more international involvement. The primary aim of the U.S. policy was to reconstruct Western Europe and to limit the spread of Soviet communism, and the post-war aid package put some $25 billion into the European economy. During the Cold War, the struggle for supremacy between the ideologies of the Soviet Union and the United States provoked various proxy wars, especially in Southeast Asia. Domestically, the 1950s were a period of great prosperity and self-confidence, and American achievements in arts and technology had a global impact. With the decline of Great Britain after the Second World War, the United States was unrivaled in the West. The 1960s saw huge social changes with the civil rights movement agitating for rights for Black people, particularly in the South, the women's movement addressing issues of female equality, and the right of social liberal counterculture. The war against communist forces in Vietnam cast a shadow over the late 1960s, and the oil embargo imposed by Arab nations in 1973 in protest against the U.S. support of Israel heralded a period of economic decline. As America faced fierce competition from the growing economies of East Asia, President Reagan's administration during the 1980s did much to restore the American economy, though with a legacy of significant budget deficits and social disruption that remains controversial. The 1990s saw further economic growth driven by the development of dot-com industry. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States was left as the world's only superpower, and its influence in the world affairs drew criticism from those alarmed by the extent of its power. The terrorist atrocities in New York on September 11, 2001, was seen as a declaration of war on American values. particularly from militant Islamics, and led to a prolonged military action in Afghanistan and Iraq, with disquieting echoes of earlier struggles in Vietnam. Domestically, the presidential election in 2000, the closest in history, marked a polarization of American politics, exemplified by the hostile response in some quarters to Barack Obama's election as president in 2008, and the rise of the conservative Tea Party movement. The recession of 2008 generated fierce debate about the best way to address the crisis, with little sign of consensus. So there we have it. That brings us more or less to, so this book was released in 2012, so that takes us to about 2012. So that's a little history of, general history from the Western standpoint of how European people got to the Americas and all the different major events that have occurred over the time period. So I don't want to say too much in this. It's just was more an informational bit to get us up to speed. What I find interesting is these books come with this wonderful little map of different civilizations over the years that have grown and been in domination, and it's interesting to note that certain ones are always in the news, so to speak. So I'm gonna make a little video of that for you too, so you can look that over as well. I find it fascinating. All right, I think I'll stop here. This was part 2 of the reading, children's book sort of history book story about the Americas and how they came to be in this way that they are right now, especially the United States. My focus is on the United States. So anyways, I am Susan Buchser-Lochocki, running for President of the United States, and I thank you for stopping by in my kitchen today. I wish you a good day.